on the Crypt.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the DAO hack was really interesting when looking at Ethereum. Like we were talking a bit earlier about kind of what the process for consensus changes might be and what, this culture war of Bitcoin. Well, I think another way to say culture war is what's the precedent? What is the precedent for how changes are made? And anytime you make a change, that to some extent sets a precedent for the future about what kinds of changes are acceptable to the community and what the community, is or isn't going to fight back against, whatever. But when you talk about the DAO, well, there's a precedent there. There's a precedent that if you steal enough money and the people kind of quote-unquote in charge lose enough money, then fuck you, that just gets reverted. As long as it's reasonably technically possible to revert it.
What are you talking about? The Ethereum community came to consensus after the DAO fork.
Yeah, in like 2 days, and there was a
vote,
and
what was
there
it like?
Wasn't
half a percentage of people voted.
Oh yeah,
half a percentage of Ethereum voters.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't blame them. They were on a timeline, and further, I really wouldn't blame them. Like that's the kind of system they want to run, and that's fine. And I think there's a lot of value in that system existing. It's not a system I'm interested in. It's not a system I want to contribute to. It's certainly not a system I would put money in because I'm trusting that development community. Whether you think they're great developers or not doesn't really matter. I don't want to trust them. I got into Bitcoin because I don't want to trust anyone. And so I have no interest in that. But other people do, and that's great. Now, I think we can build systems on top of Bitcoin that have a similar trust model and also happen to use Bitcoin the asset, which is appreciated how much this year.
All right, so how much can you talk about RSK? How much do you know about RSK?
I haven't looked at, sidechains, obviously, I know a pretty large volume about.
All right,
RSK specifically, I haven't dug into in any material way. But
that's audible to sidechains because that's something I want to see implemented.
Yeah.
Obviously, Adam Beck and Blockstream working on sidechains, and then you have Paul Sports working on sidechains as well.
Paul Sports.
Truthcoin. His last name isn't really Sports.
Storks.
I don't think
an S on the end?
I don't think he even knows how to pronounce it. But actually, I'm kidding, Paul. He definitely knows how to.
I like Paul.
But he's working on. I like him too. His drive chain. I don't want to say theory. His drive chain idea is ingenious in my mind. So let's get into side chains and drive chains. What are they, and how will they help Bitcoin?
All right. Excuse my rant. I'm a big fan of ranting.
Rant on.
I like my soapboxes. I'm gonna get up on my soapbox for a minute. So I think, historically, I've been one to work on various interesting things. I wrote the first payment channel implementation in 2013. Tried to get people to run it in 2014. No one's using it. No one's using payment channel today. I mean, it was written in 2013, scaled beautifully. You could be talking about arbing between exchanges right now instantly and for zero fee, but no one uses it. I also wrote the peg in and out mechanism for sidechains. So sidechains at a high level is a concept of like, okay, so there's Bitcoin, there's this blockchain in Bitcoin, but, maybe Bitcoin doesn't have the properties we want, whatever, so we're going to create this secondary blockchain. And the secondary blockchain is going to have maybe a different consensus model, but it's still going to use Bitcoin. And so you can kind of take your Bitcoin from the Bitcoin blockchain, you can lock it up on the Bitcoin blockchain, and then use it within the sidechain, and then withdraw it back to Bitcoin and use it however you want in Bitcoin. So that's the idea, right? So I wrote the logic to move the Bitcoin between Bitcoin and the sidechain and back for the very first version of the Blockstream Elements sidechain, which is the kind of their catch-all brand name for their sidechain implementation stuff. And, maybe it wasn't quite production ready, but in terms of, whether or not you could use it a year after I wrote it, 3 years ago now, you could have. But no one uses it. So I think the difficult part in this space for all of these kinds of technologies, whether it's payment channels or Lightning or Tumblebit or sidechains or whatever, the hard part is getting people to use it. And so, I think, sidechains kind of have two overarching security models. Getting back to security models, there's the federated model, which is to say, well, we get Coinbase and we get Bitfinex and we get Kraken and we get Gemini and we get whoever else and we get them all together and they hold the money for the sidechain. So it's, 5 of 6 multi-sig or whatever. And they hold all the money for the sidechain and then the sidechain works. Or you can have the kind of hash rate model, which is I guess kind of has now been co-opted by the term drive chains, but is broadly a sidechain proposal, which is to say, well, X percentage of the Bitcoin hash rate gets to hold the money for the sidechain. So if 51% of the Bitcoin hash rate decides, fuck you, I want to take the money, they can take the money. But if they don't, then your sidechain is secure. Now, mining centralization is obviously kind of bad right now. So the drive chain hash rate,
bad but getting
better. And I think there's ideas how to do even better that hopefully will be implemented someday by someone magical. I don't know, maybe not.
You're not referring to a POW change, right?
No. I mean like P2 pool kind of. So replacing pools, which if you're using Bitcoin, your concept of who a miner is effectively the pool, because the pool is making all the decisions for what block to mine on, what transactions to include, what transactions not to include, blah blah blah. All of those decisions are made by the pool, not the individual kind of hashers. And so irrespective of how distributed the hash rate is, it's how distributed the pools are and what hash rate different pools have that you kind of care about. But there's not kind of a technical reason for that. There's just kind of practical reasons for that. And building something in between P2 pool was kind of this idea of a decentralized pool. So all of the decisions about which transactions to include, which block to mine on, blah, 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 all the things you care about if you're a Bitcoin user are made by the individual miners, and then the profit splitting part is also decentralized. But you could take the profit splitting part and centralize that and build a more centralized pool that still has the same properties from Bitcoin's perspective of decentralization of hash rate. So anyway, slight digression.
There's a lot of buzzwords for you freaks.
Oh God, it's just so much stuff in Bitcoin.
It's a journey. That's what John said last week. It's a journey.
It really is.
You just got to start one article, one Wikipedia page, one tweet at a time.
Yeah, no, the Bitcoin is crazy.
Well, that's and again,
we're still learning.
We are still learning. But that's the best part about it, is that it's making us think about these things. Like I was explaining it to Lewis, who sometimes co-hosts this podcast with me, yesterday. Like, so when you first get Bitcoin from an exchange and then you move it to your computer, like if you download like an Electrum wallet and put it on your computer, you're like, all right, I got my money on my computer now. How fucking secure is my computer? Like, can somebody get on it? So you're like, then you're forced to like go through like OPSEC sort of security scenarios, and it forces you to learn about encryption, about hardware wallets, about paper wallets, about brain wallets, and and again, we go back to money. Money drives everything in this world, and you will do whatever it takes to secure your money. And
I think that's a big reason why Bitcoin is so fascinating to so many people, and part of why so many people got into Bitcoin in 2011, back when it was it's not worth much. It's kind of like whatever. This is interesting, but a big part of why is it ties together so many different fields. It ties together so many different parts of computer science and forces you to think about security and forces you to think about distributed computing and forces you to think about all kinds of different things about computer science. Forces you to think about money. I mentioned at some point that Bitcoiners seem to all have an opinion on monetary policy. All of a sudden, everyone has to think about economics and broad economics.
Game theory.
And game theory. Like, there's just so many interesting topics that the second you get into Bitcoin, you just get pulled down this rabbit hole of all of these fascinating ideas and all these fascinating topics. And there's just so much to learn.
You're almost forced to learn it because, again, it goes back to the money aspect. Like, people want to secure their money, and they will go to any length possible to make sure it's as secure as possible. I mean, unless they're lazy, but like for people that are serious about securing their money,
Or here's this thing that's going up so much, all your friends have it, and so you bought some of it. Now you want to figure out what the fuck it is. You go start reading about it, and there's just so much it pulls you into this learning rabbit hole, and all of a sudden it's just addictive to learn all these things.
And I'm going to recommend a good start to jump down this rabbit hole, and that's Jameson Lopp's website, his Bitcoin resources page. Just start clicking on those links. Start going through them. Oh, yeah. It's going to take you a while, but that's the best launching pad that I've
there's some folks recently. It's been great to watch. There's some folks who've made enough money on Bitcoin to kind of retire to some extent. And they retired on Bitcoin and who've decided to spend their time just creating educational resources for Bitcoin. It's been great.
It's been incredible, but that also reinforces it reinforces the ethos of Bitcoin and why it's like these people, they could go chill on a beach in the Maldives, they could go buy a yacht and go yachting. Instead, they're like, no, like,
I'm going to teach people about Bitcoin.
I'm going to teach people about this because it's that fucking important.
Yeah.
And that's something like that we're witnessing now. Like, we're going through another hype cycle. And every hype cycle, you have all the doubters, you have all the haters, you have everybody. But at the same time, you always have I don't want to say converts. We're getting very religious at that point. But, like, you have the people that are like, okay, oh, shit, there is some utility here. There is something here. And the people that are willing to go down that rabbit hole and discover everything come out. Or, no, I don't think anybody's coming out of the rabbit hole yet.
And every time we... what I'm really looking forward to, honestly... And some people hate me for this, but that's fine. I'm looking forward to the crash. I'm looking forward to Bitcoin being, I mean, fuck, at this point, $10,000, $5,000, $1,000. I'm looking forward to being cheap, quote unquote, less than it is today for an extended period of time. Because that's when the people who got sucked down the rabbit hole, they stick around. Because they're like, this is fucking fascinating. And they start reading about all these things, and they start engaging with the community and talking to people, and you get to have really awesome conversations with all these people. And then the really loud mouths, the people who are like, Bitcoin is awesome, and it's going to save the world as long as the price keeps going up. Because everyone's going to buy Bitcoin, and then the price is going to go up, and then everyone's going to be rich. Right? That's how that works. Isn't that how that works? I don't know how that works. All those people disappear. Mm-hmm. And it's just great. Like, the Bitcoin community becomes so much healthier. It becomes so much... It's interesting people who are fascinated by it, want to build an awesome Bitcoin, want to build a really awesome cryptocurrency space, and just want to work on that. Mm-hmm. And not to, like, random people who are like, yay, I'm making infinity money. Woo.
And that's, I mean... In the long run, we hope to convert all those people, but for somebody who's lived through probably the longest protracted bear market in Bitcoin's history up to this point, which is after Mt. Gox from 2014 till
it was a while
last summer. Right? It was probably like an 18-month protracted bear market, but
it's a while.
I got pulled into the rabbit hole, and I haven't jumped out since. But that was one of the when there wasn't like. It wasn't about price. Yeah. It wasn't about price. It was more about scaling, and you're talking about interesting ideas.
Yeah,
and that's
lots of drama about scaling, but
too much. And again, I think there's too much drama. We're gonna go back. I think these things are gonna change us more than we change them. And I think that's a good thing in the long run. It's gonna be a process. We're gonna have booms and busts on the way up, but I do honestly, truly believe wholeheartedly that we're gonna trend up and to the right over time in the long run.
I mean, I this is not a prediction. Please sell your Bitcoin if you've made a lot of money, because I want the price to go down. Not because I want to buy more coins, but just because I want the price to be low for a while. But I really think Bitcoin is either worth, $1 million or bust, right? It is either people... $1 million maybe is hyperbole, but either people accept it as
I don't think that's enough.
Well, maybe not, but either people accept it as a real trustless store of value. Either people say, like, this is something that I can trust. I can put money in this. It is gold version 2. It is a gold that I can send across the world relatively easily. I'm in Bitcoin to build payments ultimately. But to do that, there has to be this underlying level of secure, stable Bitcoin that is really trustworthy and that really you don't have to trust anyone to use it. And then on top of it, that's Lightning and sidechains and Coinbase and whatever else, right? But either people accept it as that or it's worthless.
Yeah,
And if they accept it as that, I mean, we're talking about like
millions of
real a nation state might be thinking about buying Bitcoin as part of their central bank holdings, right? We're talking about these kinds of fundamental shifts in the way people approach this. Or what was the point?
Exactly.
And sure, people are not going to be using Bitcoin to pay for their coffee.
No.
Sorry, it's not going to happen. People are going to use their fucking dollar to pay for their coffee because the dollar is like something...
The opportunity cost of spending your Bitcoin on a cup of coffee is too great to justify.
Yeah, it is your national currency. It's what you get paid in. It's what things are priced in. And, we talked about monetary policy, and irrespective of whether you think it's going to go up or down, like, you don't use gold to pay for your coffee in the morning. That's just not what you do.
No, I bring my gold bar and shave it down.
Yeah, it's just get a little coin and you hand that to the guy at the Starbucks. But I think that's maybe more analogous to Bitcoin in the context of how people should be thinking about valuing it with some small probability that it actually happens, but valuing it and what its use cases will be. I mean, we're talking about people buying it in large volume to hold long-term value against potential risks that are kind of macro risks across the world, and then hopefully also people can use Bitcoin in a way that you can't use gold to transact with.
Yeah.
Also, I mean,
that's the
talking about places where you have these macro risks where you're talking about like, okay, well, I'm two nation states in the Middle East and can't transact because the treasury doesn't really like me and blah, 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 and I want to do an oil deal. Well, maybe you'll use Bitcoin to actually settle that monetary value there. And I think that's becomes really interesting. And you're talking about, censorship resistance. We can build Bitcoin to, if you want to fund WikiLeaks, whatever, Julian Assange might be an asshole, but if you want to fund them, you certainly can't use Visa and you won't be able to use the dollar. Bitcoin can provide that alternative for you. And that's making sure that we provide this kind of censorship resistant money that is built on something that really has a trustless store of value. You're not trusting someone to use it. You're not trusting a developer team. You're not trusting the Fed. You're not trusting anyone unless you want to, but you don't have to trust anyone. Store of value at the base layer, I think, is really that's transformative.
It's very transformative, and that's something people can't grasp right now because we've never had it before. And people can't grasp that we have something in our hands that's never existed in the censorship-resistant ledger. And what I really like what you touched on earlier, which John and I had in a conversation post-podcast that I wish was recorded, but the way he described it, it's binary. It's either worth zero or it's worth millions of dollars. And
I think that's right.
It's binary. It's all or nothing.
And now, let me be clear. I still think there's a 5% shot it succeeds. It's not guaranteed. It's not even the most likely outcome that it kind of becomes this $1 million per Bitcoin asset. Like, don't start betting your retirement savings on this kind of thing. This is, you might get really fucking lucky, but most likely you're gonna get wiped out. Most likely it's just not.
Yeah,
gonna quote succeed.
Why do you think?
There's so many things I'm still worried about Bitcoin. I think mining centralization is a big question. How does that trend in the future? I would not still be working on Bitcoin if I didn't still have a lot of hope for it. I think there's, a lot of the kind of environmentalist arguments are overblown to some extent, because in large part, not because they're like quote unquote wrong, but in large part because Bitcoin mining is this race to the bottom to find the cheapest power. And the cheapest power in the world is renewable. It just happens to be fucking cheaper. Hydro is by far the cheapest type of power in the world. Hydro and geothermal. Nat gas actually turns out to be kind of close, which worries me to some extent.
It depends. Yeah, it depends on
But that
depends on how cold it gets in the U.S. in the winters.
yeah,
Because coming back from futures markets, like if you have severely cold winters, like nat gas price is going to go up. So
yeah,
it really depends on the weather with nat gas.
and that gas might not be as sustainable, right? And
No, it's bad. I
if
don't
you're
think
talking
it
about
is.
sustainability, well, sustainability also matters for cost, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking about especially futures markets, you're going to price things based on the sustainability of the market. So uh, I think, the cheapest power that Bitcoin miners are going to be pushed towards, assuming there's kind of a vaguely stable Bitcoin price, is going to be relatively renewable sources, primarily hydro and geothermal. And if that ends up being distributed, I mean, I think access to power is distributed on the kind of 1 megawatt scale. It's easier to find 1 megawatt or 5 megawatts or not much more than 5 megawatts of cheap power than it is to buy 100 megawatts of cheap power or 500 megawatts of cheap power. So I think there's still a lot of potential decentralization pressure there that we'll see as the market matures, but it still worries me. It's still something that I think if mining power doesn't appropriately decentralize, then Bitcoin, this like great trustless thing that might have a ton of value because you don't have to trust anyone to use it. Well, okay, fuck now. You're trusting like
3
one
people,
company
yeah.
or 5 people, like whatever.
I
That
I'm a little
destroys
more
the value.
I'm a little more hopeful after this summer, to be honest, because I think, again, like you said, I think node operators exerted their power
Yeah.
to an extent that I think a lot of people disregarded the power that node operators had, and people with Node 2x, UASF stood up and
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the various forks this year, right? There's the UASF stuff, which irrespective of what your view is, there's no question that some combination of, everyone's going to hate me for this depending on what your view is, but some combination of UASF and NYA, activated segue, right? It was not just one.
No.
It seems like everyone thinks it's just one, but no, it was the UASF movement, which I and virtually everyone who contributes to Core strongly disagreed with.
Yeah.
Very strongly denounced, again, because of kind of lack of consensus. It was a part of the community, not the whole community, whatever. But that provided some amount of pressure, a very significant amount of pressure, in my opinion, to folks to do this kind of NYA in a way that was even compatible with UASF, right? The ultimately, if you were running a UASF node and you were running an NYA node, up until 3 weeks ago, you would still be on the main chain. It ended up compatible with everyone. So that I think you can't discount that it was kind of everyone got to say they won effort.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting when we talk about how do future consensus changes happen. This everyone got to say they won property seems actually to be very successful.
Yeah.
And then we talk about the failure of 2x, the kind of hard fork part of the NYA. We talk about how that snowballed, right? There was some very vocal voices saying, "Fuck you! I want original Bitcoin," because of various issues about the kind of precedent and governance model that 2x implied and kind of set for the future of Bitcoin. And then that was enough to make people say, shit, well, now we as a business, we have to make sure that we provide users access to both, and so we have to have replay protection, because otherwise we have to implement our own replay protection. And then that became a very significant thing, and so it just kind of snowballed. And I think that that's really interesting to look at. I wish we had more kind of sociologists in Bitcoin, because I think that's kind of an interesting sociological property of how Bitcoin consensus changes do or don't happen, is that it snowballed from this kind of core group of saying, this has a bad impact on Bitcoin in some way, whether I think in large part based on the changes to consensus and precedent of how consensus changes happen. And then it snowballed into all of these companies who are shit, we're spending the last month of our time, of our engineering hours, trying to build our own replay protection, engineering hours that could be spent making our matching engines not crash our exchange. I mean, look at all of the exchanges right now. They're failing to have their There are how many exchanges right now? Their matching engines can't keep up with the amount of volume. And those engineering hours that were spent building their own replay protection for 2x could have been spent on matching engine, right?
And again, I don't want to get personal or anything, but you're touching on how hypocritical are these exchanges where they try to force this scaling change on Bitcoin, and they can't even scale their own fucking centralized websites. Like we've talked.
I don't know if that's the right argument. I mean, you want to talk about hypocritical? I mean, certainly.
But no. I think it is a right argument because it is magnitudes of order harder to scale a decentralized system, and they're running centralized systems, and they can't even scale those. And if you're gonna talk shit, you better back it up with some fucking legitimacy. And
obviously there was a certain amount of this is easy. If everyone were to have agreed to SegWit 2x, right? Let's pretend for a second that this core group, which was actually pretty large, but this kind of core group of community members of Bitcoin users who were looking at SegWit 2x and saying this is a bad change to the trust model of Bitcoin. If they didn't exist, SegWit 2x kind of would have been fine, right? I think
kind of wouldn't have worked, right? For a little bit at least.
I mean, I think there's technical issues in terms of the time scale, and I think that the kind of trust model should have been improved so that it was clear it wasn't changing the whatever. All of that aside, let's pretend SegWit 2x had 6 months of upgrade time and there wasn't this kind of New York agreement thing, and there wasn't this kind of we're changing how Bitcoin consensus, we're setting a precedent of how Bitcoin consensus rules are made. Let's pretend all of that were the case, then, SegWit 2x would have been kind of no problem. And there's when we talk about the folks who were proponents of SegWit 2x, I think that was quote unquote their view, right? Mm-hmm. Their view was there's not much reason to object to it, and I think there was a kind of misunderstanding of the reasons why people might have objected to SegWit 2x on principle against the kind of New York agreement stuff. And if that, and so they just kind of looked at that and said okay, well, let's just do this. It'll be a simple hard fork is needed now. Fees are relatively reliable, so let's just do this hard fork. And from the perspective of all these companies who are maybe could be working on matching engines, SegWit 2x would just be no big deal. Mm-hmm. It would be just change out your Bitcoin core daemon for BTC1, whatever, and then you're fine. Of course, the reality was there was strong community blowback, and New York agreement was kind of a mess, and blah, blah, blah. And so no one could do that. Your users would have sued you. That was just not practical in any way. And so it turned into a shit show. But I can't...
It was an avoidable shit show.
It was a totally avoidable shit show. But I think there's a certain amount that we need to learn from it. We need to stop and be introspective about, we need to hire some sociologists and to analyze kind of how the Bitcoin community works and how...
Matt and I are starting a fund to hire sociologists. We'll put up the address when we post this podcast.
No, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of introspection and sociological level of how does Bitcoin change.
Well,
that I think
this goes back to my point, and that it's going to change us more than we change it. It's a bunch of people trying to apply traditional system or traditional, let me think of the right phrase I want to use. It's a bunch of people trying to apply traditional management strategies to a completely new animal that we don't even understand. And what we're going to find is this animal is going to change us more than we change it. I'm going to repeat it as much as I can.
I think that's right. I mean, we're talking about like how these things snowball, how potentially you can have a small objection turn into large part of the community saying this is fucking terrible.
Yeah.
That is very hostile to traditional management.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's really novel. You look at a lot of people investing in this space and a lot of investors who don't spend a lot of time thinking deeply about how this is maybe different than traditional investments, and their immediate response is, well, I prefer Bcash, or I prefer Ethereum, or I prefer whatever. And that's fine, if you want traditional management, if you want there to be a responsible party. I mean, maybe Zcash is the best example of this. Zcash has a responsible party.
Is it really responsible, though?
Well, okay.
What they're marketing versus what they're putting out?
Ignore whatever. There is a CEO.
You can
there
be
is
anonymous.
effectively a CEO.
You can be anonymous until we decide we don't want you to be anonymous. That's Zcash's mentality right now.
The CEO makes statements that are maybe not whatever. There is a CEO, right? Like Zuko has been very clear that this Zcash is the Zcash Foundation makes decisions for the consensus rules of the Zcash network, and ultimately the buck stops with Zuko. Mm-hmm. And if you are an investor who looks at this space and you says, like, fuck, Bitcoin's a shit show, all these people arguing on Twitter, and crypto Twitter is crazy, and crypto Reddit is crazy, and blah, 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 I want there to be someone who's responsible. You look at Zcash and you're like, well, there you go. There's a responsible party. There is someone who is ultimately the buck stops with him, and when I invest on the basis of whether or not I trust him.
And, well,
that's great.
Good luck with that, because you're investing in a centralized system.
I think that this is what draws the distinction between Bitcoin and everything else in this space. Yeah. This is why I work on Bitcoin and not something else. Because, I mean, let's be honest, there are technical changes that I would love to make to Bitcoin. I would love to have ability to change Bitcoin in all kinds of wonderful ways, make all kinds of changes. Great. But then what would I be working on? Mm-hmm. I'd be working on yet another altcoin, yet another PayPal. I think that's the great example. Like yet another PayPal, except, I mean, maybe cryptographic PayPal, but centralized third-party PayPal. And I just am not interested in that.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to these are raw nation technologies. We don't understand them. And it's going to take time. Like, people are trying to apply old world sort of mentalities and systems and management practices to these new technologies. And personally, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say all of these people that are trying to apply these old world management systems are going to get blown the fuck out in the long run.
Yeah, I think
I just wish everybody would be more modest in their approach to this stuff. There's a lot of people who think they have all the answers, but what we're gonna realize is nobody does. And going back to the question of governance, I've said this multiple times on Tales from the Crypt. Governance is an emergent property of these systems. It just is. We reach governance every 10 minutes, and whatever nodes run every 10 minutes is governance. Like, you're not going to apply a top-down structure that leads us to governance.
Obviously, that's a simplification. But yeah, no, totally. I mean, the governance of these systems is like, it's based on precedent, and it is emergent. It is, I mean, I hate the word emergent now because it's kind of been bastardized in this space, but
I'm a bastard.
But yeah, no, it really is, right? I mean, we talk about studying how SegWit 2x did or didn't fail and how the activation of SegWit happened. Like, that is something you study to figure out how the community works. That's not something that you kind of define, well, here's how the community, does these things, and then that's the rules. And it is it's a thing about precedent, and it's a thing about, you study how historical changes happen to look to the future.
Yeah. You have to take a retrospective look to move forward.
Definitely.
Yeah. How much time you got?
I got time.
What are you most excited about moving forward for Bitcoin specifically?
What am I most excited about? I'm excited about the adoption of these second layer and other systems, right? I mean, I mentioned briefly that this is something that I have worked on since 2013, right? I implemented the very first payment channel implementation in the summer of 2013, and sidechain peg in, peg out mechanism way back in the day. Like, these are things that I've been working on for years and years, but have seen zero adoption effectively. And we're at a position now where everyone's kind of looking at where they stand technically and thinking, okay, maybe it is time to start adopting these things. Maybe it's time to start really thinking about how we can fit these into our current business and fit these into our user experience. And finally seeing some adoption of these things that, I've been working on for years is really exciting because it opens up Bitcoin to all kinds of new possibilities, all kinds of new trust models, all kinds of new ways of interacting with Bitcoin, the asset, that we haven't had until now. So
yeah,
that's absolutely
we're
exciting.
Entering a whole new world.
Yeah.
So let's go through Lightning Network. What kind of use cases will this enable if it becomes somewhat ubiquitous?
I think the most obvious is the Bitcoin side of arbing, right? The exchanges. It's centralized more than Lightning even is, but you talk about being able to hold money off of Lightning Network and off of exchanges in your own hands in a Lightning wallet that is really your money that no one can take from you, and sell it immediately in well under a second. That's really interesting for how the market works, and also requires relatively limited kind of technical effort, right? There's a few companies, they add Lightning Wallet, and all of a sudden you can arb between exchanges and you can hold your own money in your own Lightning Wallet, deposit to an exchange instantly and sell instantly. And then if you have Bitcoin on one exchange, you can move to another exchange instantly and sell, and you can at least do the Bitcoin side of the arb instantly. And I think that is, again, right, that's something that requires limited effort to start adopting, but also can make a big difference to both transaction volumes on the chain and how people interact with the Bitcoin market. So I think that'll be the first big thing we see. And then after that, it'll be, me and all my friends who use Bitcoin, I'll be paying them in Bitcoin, they'll be paying me in Bitcoin. We'll be seeing things like...
have like a Venmo.
Yeah, Venmo kind of. Like, people who are doing payments within social networks, social networks, not like the websites, social, not like Facebook, whatever, but like social networks like me and my friends will start using Lightning and that kind of adoption. Right?
Yeah. No, and I think the exchange arbing use case is one with very high incentive too, and one that will get adopted quickly because this space is I don't want to say dominated, but there's a lot of traders in this space. So that's definitely like a good use case, like out of the box that will get used in my opinion.
Yeah,
I'd actually never heard of that use case, which is fascinating to me.
I think, when I talk to exchange folks right now, they're the ones, it seems to me, who are the most ready to start integrating this. You talk to a lot of the exchanges in this space, they've integrated all kinds of rando cryptocurrency garbage. They've integrated,
I think
IOTA, whatever. They're running like this daemon for some random cryptocurrency no one ever really gave a shit about. And whatever. They're ready to adopt all kinds of new crazy technology. And Lightning's on that scale not at all crazy. It's like great, stable, whatever compared to nonsense cryptocurrencies. But
at the same time, it's a double-edged sword because Lightning's going to enable atomic swaps as well.
Yeah, potentially. I don't think we'll see good UX for that for a while.
No.
A and B.
So let's back up. What is an atomic swap?
There we go.
Yeah,
that's important. So an atomic swap, we talk about when you're trading two cryptocurrencies, right? So you have IOTA and I have Bitcoin, and we want to trade at some price. You can do this thing called an atomic swap, which you both go on chain on your respective cryptocurrency, and it allows us to trade kind of person to person without going through an exchange. With Lightning, you could potentially do this instantly, right? So you don't have to go on chain, and you can kind of get some of the same properties. But I would highlight that you still have to have some kind of order book. You still have to have something that you can use, because ultimately, sure, person-to-person exchanges are always going to be, over-the-counter is always going to be an important part of Bitcoin trading. And, local Bitcoin, whatever, it's going to be an important part. It's going to be there, but it's not going to be where people go for price discovery. It's not going to be the place where there is a ton of liquidity and people trading large volumes to discover what the price is on Bitcoin. It's going to be where people trade small volumes person to person that they just don't want to use exchanges for whatever reason. And I think the same is true for Lightning atomic swaps. It is going to require these kind of price discovery has to happen when you have an order book which you can trust. And the only way to have an order book which you can trust is for there to be an exchange which actually has the money to back it up, like from their users, right? And so even if there's this Lightning thing where you can deposit to an exchange instantly and issue an order, that's great, but you're not going to get away from depositing to an exchange to make an order on the order book.
You need more information.
You need that trusted order book.
Yeah.
And I don't think Lightning's going to replace that. It might take a dent into like some of the crypto to crypto exchange stuff that people are doing person to person right now and kind of decentralized exchange, but it's not going to take the place of the price discovery stuff.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so there's always going to be a market for centralized exchanges.
Yeah. No, and that's the one thing that also is like that we're also finding a lot of people in the space are misguided about, is that we need to decentralize all the things, and sometimes, to a certain extent, that's not.
It's either not possible or it's just not
efficient.
a good idea. It's not always a thing, right?
Yeah, I don't want to shit on Ethereum too much, but like that's their main marketing perspective is like, let's blockchain all the things, let's decentralize everything.
Blockchain the Tamagotchis.
But there's efficiencies in centralization to a certain extent.
There is, and I think this was my point earlier, that we need to try our hardest to make sure that the decentralized systems we build are as efficient as we can make them. And centralized systems are always going to be more efficient, but we want to try to close that gap.
Yeah.
And closing that gap is important to making sure that people have the ability to use Bitcoin in a decentralized, trustless, and most importantly, censorship-resistant way, whereas not closing that gap means you have to trust Coinbase for everything.
Yeah, and that goes against the whole ethos of what this technology was created for.
Yeah.
So what were we touching on? I was about to ask you, what do you want to talk about? Like, what do you think is most important that needs to be touched on that we haven't touched on?
That we haven't touched on. I mean,
and we're out of Pilsners, by the way. So we've got Lager.
I drink the Brooklyn Lager occasionally. What's the other one?
The Defender IPA. I hate IPAs.
All right, well,
lager.
Give me the lager. I will drink the IPA if I have to, but thank you.
Yeah. So let's touch on that. What do you think that we haven't touched on that needs to be touched on?
Yeesh. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of the conversation that I think is the most important right now for the Bitcoin community, but also anyone just getting into Bitcoin, is this kind of sociological aspect of how changes get made to Bitcoin, and what does that mean for your trust model and who you're trusting, and what is, how do changes get made, and how does that impact your ability to use the system in the same way that you're using it now? I think that's by far the most important kind of element to Bitcoin right now that needs to be figured out as a community, not as individuals, as a community.
How does this happen?
We hire some sociologists. I think. I think that's what we've concluded. We need to fund some sociologists. But I think it's also. I mean, I mentioned that some folks refer to it as a culture war, and I think that is the right lens through which to look at it. Is what is the culture of changes to Bitcoin that we want, that we believe in, that we think, creates a Bitcoin that will last a long term, that, that we're willing to fight for.
All right, let's touch on Linux's culture then. Rough consensus. Is that working Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, well, Linux maybe is a separate thing. Linux is very kind of centrally controlled. There's a tree, right? There's Linus, and then for each of the kind of subsystems, there's a subsystem maintainer, and that is, they're in charge of it. It's more, it obviously, I think works well in open source. It's kind of the model we're looking to move towards in Bitcoin Core for the non-consensus parts, for RPC and the net logic and like all these things that no one cares about aside from Bitcoin Core, like whatever.
So let's take a step back and delineate between protocol changes and non-protocol changes.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of parts of Bitcoin Core, right? There's the GUI. There's this like graphical user interface client that has like a window that pops up and like gives you send buttons and you can do things, and it has spinning widgets and whatever the fuck else. I don't know. I don't use it. I have no fucking clue. But like ultimately, someone's got to be responsible for making the spinning widgets be nice and pretty. And that doesn't impact anyone who's not using Bitcoin Core, right? If you're using Coinbase or you're using a mobile wallet or you're using whatever it is, you don't care what kind of spinning widgets there are in Bitcoin Core GUI. It just doesn't affect you. And so, these are things that don't affect every Bitcoin user. They affect, maybe users of Bitcoin Core's wallet, maybe users of Bitcoin Core as their client to check, whatever, their wallet or the GUI or whatever. There's a lot of different. 95% of the work in Bitcoin Core is just that, or the performance of it, or whatever. All of these changes don't impact everyone who uses Bitcoin. They only impact Bitcoin Core users. Mm-hmm. And in a way that you could go use anything else. Okay. And so these are changes that, I think we look more towards vaguely centralized, not centralized in that way, but more central structures. We're not going and asking on Reddit whether we should merge some new performance improvement in Bitcoin Core. That would be absurd, because who cares? And so that's wholly separate from Bitcoin Core, the consensus part of it. So, the consensus rules of Bitcoin, the rules about whether transactions are valid, whether blocks are valid, all of these things, that obviously impacts everyone using Bitcoin, right? If you create a transaction and it's invalid according to the consensus rules, no one's going to accept it. That's invalid. And so, we draw a very, very clear distinction in Bitcoin Core between things that are not consensus rules and that we, want to make progress on and want to build good software around, and things that are consensus rules and things that, we look to the community for adoption. We don't, try to make those rules on our own. Another Bitcoin Core contributor refers to Bitcoin Core as a process. It is less a software project and more a process.
It is a process.
And, I don't think that really is true for all of the non-consensus parts. The wall is, again, 95% of the work, 99% of the work.
It's a process.
But at the protocol level, Bitcoin Core is a process. It is a, way we look to the community for changes and adoption of these kind of ideas and what changes should be made to Bitcoin. We had like a whole thing. We were talking about something, and then we kind of went into a tangent. I have no idea what we were talking about earlier.
We were talking about how we reached consensus to change the protocol level, and I asked you to distinguish between the protocol level and.
Oh yeah, so you asked about Linux and other engineering communities, and I think so draw a distinction between protocol level and non-protocol level. And I think maybe Linux is a good example of this stuff for the non-protocol level. Mm-hmm. It's, I think Linux is even more centralized than Bitcoin Core by far in terms of how decisions are made about code level changes. But we're trying to move maybe a bit more in that direction. Bitcoin Core, to be honest, has a scaling problem right now in terms of just the number of new contributors getting in. And, historically there's been 4 or 8 people who have seen and reviewed almost every vaguely major change in the entire code base, and all of a sudden that doesn't scale, right? All of a sudden we have more people coming in who want to work on making the spinning widgets spin faster and whatever the fuck else, I don't know. And, finding the right threshold between, everyone looking at everything and enough people looking at things such that there's no bugs in issues for people who use Bitcoin Core is something we're trying to find out right now. Whereas on the other hand, at the protocol level, at the how Bitcoin works at a protocol level, the consensus rules, and also the peer-to-peer network, maybe a better example is the IETF. Okay. So people who don't know what the IETF is effectively what decides how the internet works. They're a engineering body of engineers for engineers who decide, how your web browser, how Firefox communicates to a server that's going to serve the page and what format that takes, and all these kinds of weird details that just really, really low-level networking, incredibly low-level networking.
Stuff that your average Joe has no idea about.
Stuff that your average engineer has no idea about, even.
Yeah.
And their model, kind of motto of how they decide things, which was set years and years ago, is, quote, you should pull it up, but it's something like, we reject kings and democracy. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And I think that's more towards Bitcoin at a consensus level.
We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code.
There we go. That's it. So this is years and years old of IETF. This is how IETF views itself, how they kind of try to make decisions. And I think that's more towards how people view Bitcoin consensus changes, especially the first part. We reject the kings, voting, and what was it? Presidents. Sorry, we do not want kings, voting, or presidents in Bitcoin. No, not even close.
We do not. You don't want a democracy because at the end of the day, let's be truthful, most people are stupid. I'm sorry, I hate to admit that.
Ignore most people being stupid. Democracy is 3 wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner.
Yeah.
It doesn't end well for the sheep.
Oh, I've never heard that one. I love that. How have I never heard that?
That's an Adam Back favorite.
Really? How have I never heard that one? Holy shit!
Adam loves that one.
But I
think it's really fucking accurate for like what this actually means, right? But I think democracy is not the bar we want, and in fact, even rough consensus and running code is probably not quite enough. Rough consensus in Bitcoin is probably not close, but
why not?
It almost gets there. So rough consensus in IETF needs a bit of explanation. Like, what the fuck does a rough consensus mean, right? So rough consensus in IETF largely means there are no outstanding objections which have not been addressed. So, if there's some proposal to change how the internet works at a very low level, and Bob comes up and Bob says, well, here's the problem. I think this doesn't quite work for this setup, and this is going to cause problems on the internet. Mm-hmm. The basic goal is that should be addressed before this kind of proposed standard change rolls forward. And I think that's probably true of Bitcoin. It leaves that part of it of like, yes, if there is someone who shows up and says, this change is going to affect my ability to use Bitcoin, yeah, that damn well better be addressed before that change happens. Mm-hmm. However, in IETF, that means to some extent there is kind of a formal hierarchy, and there's this formal setup for how changes get accepted and how people decide whether or not a change has been sufficiently addressed. And there's ultimately kind of one person in each working group who can say like, well, that change is bullshit and you're just bullshitting and fuck you. Mm-hmm. And then there's like this whole thing, if like people object, then they like roll dice, and like it's this whole thing.
Comes down to a dice roll?
There's a formal process in IETF to come down to I believe it's a coin flip, not a dice roll.
Holy shit.
It never gets used because that's not practical. But if we're talking about Bitcoin and money and something that is maybe even more contentious than
want it to come down to the dice roll.
Arguments about whatever, you don't want a coin flip. That's not what you really too. So I think IETF is maybe the best model that we have for analogies to how I would like Bitcoin to work in the long term, but it is certainly not sufficient. And trying to say like, well, IETF is how Bitcoin's going to work. I think that ignores a lot of the differences between Bitcoin and everything else. Right?
Bitcoin might set a new standard.
I think Bitcoin is going to be a very different way of thinking about changes to protocols.
No, and this, I mean, it goes back to the theme of what we've been talking about tonight. It's just like we have no idea, like, what these technologies are,
definitely.
what they're going to do to us, and that's why I love what John's advice was last week. Is just like all you can do is learn more. Just try and learn as much as possible. Like begin your journey. Just continue reading. Like we said, anybody that says they're an expert is an asshole. Like nobody knows. Nobody.
It's been my full-time job to figure out Bitcoin for. I mean,
since high school.
I've been working almost full-time since high school. I took some time off in college. Like, I actually, had a college that I, went to. It was fun.
What college?
UNC. Chapel Hill.
Boss?
Chapel Hill was a lot of fun. Love Chapel Hill. Still fucking hate Duke. They're all assholes. Fuck anyone who ever went to Duke. Fucking people. God.
It's a different breed. I will say this.
It's a different breed.
In high school, we used to go down to Duke and do spring training for lacrosse down there. I'm not a Duke guy at all, but I remember the Tobacco Road rivalry very, very vividly.
Yeah. No, the rivalry is fun if nothing else. It's all that said. It's been almost my full-time job since 2011 to figure out Bitcoin. I still don't think I know Bitcoin. I don't.
No,
not an expert per se. Maybe I know better than most, but like, I'm still learning.
And that's why I think
still trying to learn.
I think that's why people become so enamored with it. It's like, holy shit, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
Like I need to figure it out. And
yeah.
The further you dig, the less you know. And that's the craziest part.
Yeah.
The further you dig, the less you know. And that's my favorite part about like these new adoption waves is everybody coming in like, I just discovered the blockchain. I know how to fix it. And it's watching people get humbled in real time is. I don't want to.
I think it's Jimmy Song who had this chart that he said of like, when you get into Bitcoin, you're like, wow, I don't know anything, and then for the first like 6 months, you're like, wow, I'm becoming an expert, and then like 6 months in, you're like, wow, I fucking know Bitcoin. I get it, and you're like explaining it to people, and then at kind of 7 months, you realize, no. You're an idiot, and actually, no one has any fucking clue what the hell this thing is, and everyone's still trying to figure it out.
And I do know exactly what you're talking about. I don't know if Jimmy or somebody else is the source of that chart, but I have seen that chart. Like, you for 6 months in, you're like, all right, I'm picking it up, expert. And then 3 months later, you come to the realization that you don't know shit.
Like, what the fuck is that?
And that's why it's so great to be alive right now. It's like, we have something that finally, like, it's such a diametrically opposed system to what we grew up in, where we grew up in a system where it's like, all right, you go to school, you go to kindergarten through senior year of high school, then you go to college, and this is the way life works. Like, you do this. You have this schedule, you become a professional, you knock up somebody, you get married, you raise a family, restart the whole cycle again. And then Bitcoin just comes in, it's like, I'm going to fuck up this cycle. And we're literally, like, and that's why I'm so drawn to it. It's like, what the fuck is, like, I need to know what this is doing to us. And
I mean, it has the potential to be world changing. It is.
I would argue that it already has changed the world to a certain extent, just getting people thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I mean, I was at Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, yeah.
And talking to one of my second cousins, I guess, and she was just kind of like, yeah, I'm recently getting into cryptocurrencies. I've got a colleague at work teaching me about it. I'm investing in Litecoin. I was like, cool. I mean, hey, it wasn't IOTA, so.
Had a lot of people ask about Litecoin this week.
Really, Litecoin?
That's like, yeah, well, that's fucking Coinbase. It's like, you go to
That's
Coinbase,
true.
you get
That's
free
true.
options, like
Litecoin, ETH, and Bitcoin.
That's the other thing.
I'd buy Litecoin over Bcash, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean,
By an order of magnitude.
I think the use case of
Litecoin
Litecoin
is
as a testnet is a good use case.
well,
But
Litecoin is Bitcoin, but centralized-ish control,
yeah,
right? If you want these developers are competent, they know what they're doing, but it's not Bitcoin in the sense that they're taking slightly more explicit control than Bitcoin. It's Litecoin. That's the thing I would go use.
yeah, and
It's not like ETH is crazy, move fast and break things. Litecoin is we're developers, we're conservative, but we are kind of in control of this system.
yeah.
Bitcoin is no one's in control. This is just a fucking roller coaster. Let's see where it goes. Like Litecoin, I mean, it makes sense as a product that you might wish to invest. I don't have any fucking Litecoin, but I understand why some people like it.
No, I do, but I don't think people understand
Oh no,
it. Like
no one has any fucking.
I don't think anybody understands it like you would think they do. It's just they see the options when they sign up for Coinbase. Should I buy Ethereum, Litecoin, or Bitcoin? It's like, oh well, Litecoin's like just like Bitcoin, but it's
cheaper.
Way cheaper. Like, duh.
You should buy the cheaper one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
totally.
How do we get away from like I'm like tired of like dealing with that argument.
I don't know, man.
No, at this point it's like, all right, go for it.
Yeah.
We'll see how it plays out in the long run. It's tough, and that's the other thing. Like, you have such a, for myself at least, definitely like such like a. You think you have control of. I don't want to say the narrative, but like you feel like you can explain this to people in layman's terms, like off the bat, and then you're just confronted with it, and it's like, whoa, like I truly don't understand this shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, totally. Yeah, man, I can't explain this to anyone. A very, very good friend of mine recently was coming to me and is like, yeah, I'm going to buy some Bitcoin, some Ethereum. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, I would really like to spend some time explaining to you, someone who's very technical, like, really smart technically, I'd really like to spend some time explaining to you why Ethereum is, in my opinion, just vaguely, largely poor technical decisions, a series of poor technical decisions, in my opinion. And then I thought about it for a minute. I'm like, holy fuck. I'm going to have to spend like 6 hours explaining to you why I think Ethereum is less valuable than Bitcoin in the long term. Do I really want to spend 6 hours explaining that to you? Or do I just want to say, like,
working on payment channels? It's
not even, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, wait, I don't want to. You're going to invest in both? Great. Better than. And also to some extent, like, the markets in this space are absurdly irrational. I like to say that I have fully stopped trying to day trade in this space. It's absurd.
I stopped years ago. It's not even worth it.
Yeah, I stopped years ago, largely because, I look at all these things through a lens of technical, do I think your project is technically capable? Do I think it's going to go somewhere technically? Blah, blah, blah. Oh my God, the markets don't give a fuck.
No, they don't.
Not at all. I sit here and I'm like, well, this IOTA thing is bullshit.
Markets are about
short the fucking shit out of IOTA. Oh, wait, it's like number 4 in market cap.
Yeah. After working in finance, like you find that it all comes down to asset flows, like where the assets are flowing into what securities.
Well, I mean, what's the common saying? The market will remain irrational longer than you can stay liquid. I found that out the hard way a few times.
It's probably the only good thing Keynes ever said was the market can remain illogical for longer than you can remain liquid.
Yeah.
But let's move on. Let's get a little interesting here.
Uh-oh.
I told you
we were reading Cosmic again?
No, we're not going to get cosmic. We're going to talk about diets. I told you
diets.
This. I told you this before we...
Vegans, I'm all the way. Crypto vegans.
Before we started recording, we've got a sector of carnivores in Bitcoin, and we've got a sector of vegans as well, and you fall under the vegan sector.
I am a vegan.
I fall in the middle. I'll eat everything. I'm an omnivore. I don't give a shit. Like, I can eat a smoothie. I could eat a steak. I could do whatever.
Neither of those are vegan.
Neither?
A smoothie has milk in it.
No, I mean, no, I don't. No, I'm talking about like apples, bananas, acai. Like,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm not. I don't. I told you I don't drink dairy anymore.
All right.
But I think it's funny, the dichotomy of crazy diets.
There's crypto vegans and crypto carnivores, and there's
But I think it's funny that like just the whole diet aspect has trickled into the crypto space.
Oh yeah, cryptocurrency. Yeah, there's who's the most? It's probably Zuko's the most famous crypto carnivore, right? He's like.
I think he started the trend, but I would say Bitstein, Michael Goldstein is probably the most, and Saifedean are probably the most adamant at this point.
Okay, I could see that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I'm completely honest, I caught veganism, and
You caught veganism?
Caught veganism. Veganism to most men is an STD.
What the fuck?
No.
You went out with a girl?
Yeah, you go out with someone. You go out with someone for a while, and they're vegetarian or vegan, and so that's the only thing you eat. And after a certain point, you're like, yeah, this
When's the last time you had
this meat thing or this dairy thing? It's just not appetizing anymore. So I went out with a vegetarian for a while in college, and almost was vegetarian. Then went over with a vegan for a while after college, and then full on caught the vegan STD. And there's, you would be surprised how many folks I know who caught veganism or vegetarian as an STD.
Are you in it for the dietary aspect or the humanitarian aspect, or the
taste preference? Honestly, at this point, like I just haven't had meat in, I don't know, 3 years, 4 years, and like it is no longer appetizing. You don't have it for long enough, and you just kind of look at it and you're like, I could eat the flesh of a dead animal, or I could not do that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I live in New York, so I could just go get falafel, and it's better. And
I fucking love falafel and hummus. That's
one
of my favorite
I mean,
meals.
At a certain point, if anything, it's easier, right? Because like I don't have to spend as much time trying to find a freaking restaurant to go to. I can just be like, vegan restaurants. Okay, there we go. Mm-hmm. It's just, it is easier, and I would prefer to not eat a carcass of a dead animal or something that came out of a cow's udder, or like whatever the fuck. Like I just, why would I eat that?
To each his own.
Just does not appetize me. It doesn't make me excited about eating food. And there's great fucking vegan food here in New York. Like there's a Michelin star vegan restaurant here in New York.
Which one?
Sorry, vegetarian restaurant. Nick's is vegetarian.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of By Chloe? You like By Chloe?
They're fast foody too much sometimes. Yeah. I don't know. By Chloe's good, but there's
you go to like Mediterranean, like.
My go-to is falafel. Yeah, Mediterranean.
Yeah. I'm a sucker for hummus and falafel.
Oh God, who isn't? There's a what's it called? There's a falafel place literally across the street from my apartment. It's like I go home. They close at 10, so it like gets me out of the office at 9. I go home, get falafel on the way home. That's like that's my dinner 4 nights a week.
How many falafels do you eat? How many falafel pucks do you eat?
I mean, whatever they put in a sandwich. 8 maybe?
Yeah, it was a stupid question. I've actually got pizza night at home. I gotta get home in like an hour.
All right.
We're warming up the stone oven. The stone in the oven
Yeah.
right now. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've got one more question for you.
All right.
When is the blue hair coming back?
When's the blue hair coming back? I don't know. In SF, it's like, every third person has blue hair. Who gives a fuck? It's fun.
Did you live in San Fran?
I did. I lived in San Fran for 3 years.
Okay.
2 and change.
Okay. You
like
are
whatever.
the blue Matt. Like I was expecting
It's
you to
true.
come in with blue hair.
I mean, I had blue hair for a long time. I had it. I did it in college the first time, and then just had it for.
Because you went to UNC or because you had an affinity to blue?
No, it's fucking random. I've been Blue Matt for since middle school. Actually,
Really?
I've been Blue Matt since middle school,
Where'd you grow
long
up?
before North Carolina.
Oh, you grew up in North
I grew
Carolina?
up in Charlotte, actually.
Okay. I lived in Charleston, South Carolina for a little bit.
Charleston.
I
All
love the
right, all
Carolinas.
right.
Big fan of the Carolinas.
Yeah, I love the Carolinas insofar as they don't have interesting political decisions sometimes, but
Yeah.
it's whatever.
I appreciate the landscape and the smells and
Oh yeah.
the culture of being outside as much as possible.
Oh yeah. Charlotte's weird. I grew up in Charlotte, right? Charlotte is a island of not the South in the middle of the South. You drive 20 minutes in any direction and you're in the fucking South. Charlotte itself, you're not in the South. It's weirdly like transplants from New York and whatever else. Anyway, so I did the blue hair. I've been Blue Matt forever. I did the blue hair kind of independently. A friend of mine did her hair, and I did my hair at the same time. We were just kind of like, yeah, whatever. And then everyone kind of assumed it was UNC blue because it happened to be the right color. And I was like, okay, whatever, I'll stick with it. And then I stuck with it for a number of years living in San Fran because, whatever, it's normal in San Fran. It's a bit less normal in New York. I'm still trying to decide if I'm going to do it again.
I like both. I like the blonde. I'm a blonde hair kid myself. I appreciate blondes when I see them. It's
I am appreciating natural hair color more.
Yeah. No, it's
We'll see.
I think it's a good look on you. I think the blonde is a good look. Blue is a good look as well, but
thanks.
Not gonna force you to anything. All right. What advice do you have for our listeners, to the freaks out there? A parting note. Let's keep in mind that most of the people listening to this are probably relatively new to Bitcoin and crypto.
New to Bitcoin. I mean, obviously don't invest more than you can afford to lose. We've hit this a few times. Don't like this. This
Can't
is
stress
experimental.
It enough,
this stuff just it might very well go to zero. And by might very well, I mean probabilistically, it is most likely the stuff goes to zero. Don't get too excited about markets. The market goes up and down. Avoid playing into the emotion. It is hard to look at a market and not get emotional and see it go up and want to buy and see it go down and want to sell. That's how you lose money. But enjoy getting carried away with learning in this space. There is so much to learn about. There are so many topics that Bitcoin will lead you down a rabbit hole of so many different interesting things. Go down the rabbit hole. Enjoy it. Learn something new. Learn something exciting that you hadn't thought about, that you've never considered as an issue in modern society. Get excited about it.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's, like I've been saying recently, I've reached my Bitcoin Zen because I don't care if it crashes or goes to millions of dollars, because the amount I've learned and the people I've met and the experiences I've had are so worth it. And again, like, this could potentially, if it is successful, it's not highly probable. It's probable to a certain extent. It's not highly probable. It will usher in the next enlightenment, and I'm happy that I'm alive now to go along for this ride.
The ride's a hell of a lot of fun.
It's a hell of a ride. I think it has led to some hair loss.
Oh yeah.
I've got a bad genetic receding hairline I've inherited from my family, but I think the Bitcoin ride has expedited the amount of hair loss I have right now. Totally worth it. Totally worth it. With that being said, Matt, where can we learn more about you? Where can we find you?
I'm at the Blue Matt on Twitter. I'm one of those weird people who reads all of my public DMs, so you're welcome to ping me, ask me questions, whatever. I don't always respond, but occasionally I find the time to respond, go through my DMs, and respond to things. I also contribute to Bitcoin Core and hang out on IRC. If you're really committed and you want to get into development, IRC is the place to be. But
I don't think most of our listeners are know
probably
what IRC
not.
is.
Probably not.
With that being said, that's all we got for this week, freaks. Peace and love.
Cheers.